Hi, I'm your host, Miles Goldsmith, and this is my podcast, Game Design Hour, where I interview the designers of the games you love. On today's episode, I sat down for an interview with Dave Jaffe, the creator of God of War. Today's episode is sponsored by Hoffman's Woodstuffs. They specialize in the design and fabrication of custom furniture made from sustainably sourced hardwoods. Stick around to the end of the episode to get a 20% discount off your next order. So sit back and relax and enjoy the episode. So when did you first remember wanting to become a video game developer?
It was not the intention. I went out to LA from Alabama. I met your dad in college at USC to make movies. I wanted to write screenplays. I wanted to direct films. And after college, I needed a job. And I had always loved video games. I had made video games, like real simple ones and basic as a kid growing up. And as I needed a job, I kind of heard about this thing called game testers. And I was reading EGM, which was a video game magazine at the time, and they were talking about this game based on Dracula, the movie. And they're like, oh, they're making it in Santa Monica. And I'm like, oh, that would be so cool if I could get a job there. And so I literally opened the phone book. This is back when there were phone books. I don't know if you know what that is. And obviously, in the great AI wars of 2000, Siri and Alexa destroyed all the phone books. I said, oh, look, there's a company called Sony ImageSoft here in Santa Monica. And I called them and I said, hey, I hear there's this thing called testers. And they said, yeah, it just so happens we're hiring one. And that's how I got in. And once I was in, it was very interesting because it was right around that time that video games were starting to be high fidelity, I guess, enough, or high enough, not visual resolution, but just overall resolution of the product, that you could start to get more cinematic, filmic storytelling, character design, kind of more. You could bring more than just art and code to it. You could bring more personal imagination and vision to it. And because I was already trying to do that in film, when I realized, holy cow, I'm sitting here with Sony and all their resources and their money, and there's very little competition in this field at the moment. There is now, but there wasn't then. Why don't I just use all these resources to try to tell the stories that interest me? And so that's kind of how it happened. It was never an intention. I had actually sold a few TV shows that I ignorantly thought were going to get made. And so, I didn't realize that just because you sell a TV show, it doesn't mean it's going to go on the air. Right. So I was like, oh, this is just like a part-time job, not part-time, but like I'll do this for a few months. Then I'm going to go off and be, a great filmmaker. That didn't happen. And I started to realize, holy cow, look at all the creative freedom and fun and resources I have. And that's really how it happened. I was never on a track to be a designer. I didn't grow up caring about state tables and 20-sided dice and all that stuff, or die. I was just like, I liked stories and characters and science fiction and fantasy. And this was a way to kind of express that as quick as possible without having to try to make my way in Hollywood and hope to God somebody gave me a shot. I was like, they're already giving me a shot. Let me do it here. That's why. That's how it worked.
Just for anyone who's not used to video game design, what is a state table?
It's basically as simple as if you ever played Dungeons and Dragons, it's like a spreadsheet that says your character is a level 4 wizard. It doesn't have to be, it could be a football player on Madden. It could be Call of Duty soldier, but a level 4 wizard. And with that, here are 25 columns of what it means to be a level 4 wizard. He has this much strength. He moves this quickly. When he walks over a certain surface, because other characters walk and he levitates, the sound cue that Unity or Unreal or whatever engine you're using, which is sort of like the movie camera of video games, whatever sound plays is more of a hover sound and not an actual footfall on wood sound, right? So it's everything that it means to be that character broken down in numerical values. So basically, the computer can look at it and go, I don't really know what a wizard is, and I don't really care what a wizard is, but you're telling me this is the sound file to execute when this character's volume moves past this volume. Okay, I can do that for you. So that's that kind of and I don't use the word nerdy in a disrespectful way. I mean, I'm a total nerd in a lot of ways, but that's that kind of very nerdy math, not even math, but nerdy stats and really getting into the meat and potatoes of why things work that I was never really interested in. I got interested in it because it was fascinating how just those numbers could affect someone having fun or someone walking away and saying this is boring. But that was never interesting to me when I was growing up.
After college, what were some of the most important lessons as a video game tester that you learned about creating games?
Well, as a tester, not much. I was a tester for about 3 months, and I was so ambitious and so driven that Disney came in and they said, "Hey, we want to do this Mickey Mouse birthday thing. He's 65 years old. Can we get a game?" And they were going to all the companies, who made games, and we were one of them. And I said, "Hey, to my bosses, can I pitch this? And if we get it, can I be a designer, producer, whatever?" And so I was very quickly designing games at Sony. And the biggest lesson I learned, honestly, is designing and directing video games is not it, but it is absolutely a team sport. And that is not to suggest that there aren't key people who hold the vision and define the vision. There are writers, there are directors, there are lead designers, and they obviously carry more of the burden and the joy of creating than, say, someone who's just working at Naughty Dog and their whole job is to spend 3 years doing rust textures to go on the cars in the post-apocalyptic landscape of The Last of Us Part 2, right? But that said, though, I had come at it as a kid in Alabama watching people make movies. I'm not like you and your dad and Ramses and all your friends and stuff that you see that stuff. I was watching behind the scenes specials in Alabama going, "Oh, the director's in charge and he shouts commands and whatever he says people do." And I spent a year and a half being a hated video game designer and director because I was trying to be that, because I thought that's what you did. And so the hardest lesson was really to learn that the people that you're working with are highly skilled, highly paid, highly educated, highly talented, and they are there not only to execute your vision, but to bring their own talents so that your vision becomes a better vision that can only exist with their abilities funneled through your filter of what you, as ultimately the final creative say, feels needs to go into the product. So I learned a lot, but I would say that's probably the biggest lesson I learned, which is it really is a team sport. And you've got to find a balance between you making sure you go home at night satisfied that you have creatively contributed and that you are satisfied with the work that you are contributing. And at the same time, that you have benefited from this amazing team that is also feeling a valid and necessary sense of ownership in the title. So,
What's the one glitch from your time as a playtester or when designing games that still haunts you to this day that you just sunk so many hours into?
not much. I didn't care. I know that sounds terrible. I cared. I did the job. I found some bugs. I worked. I was a good employee, but I, you know, testing was a step on the ladder to get to. I was like, dude, I was like just a junkyard dog. All I wanted was to express my creative ideas. And once I got into Sony, I was like, this is a means to an end. So there are testers. There are wonderful testers that are crucial, whether you're talking about bugs or whether you're talking about just, quality assurance of like, hey, this, I'm playing a game right now, which is great, called Blue Fire, and it controls beautifully. It just feels so good to control the character. But the first couple of levels, the developer has placed this kind of like lava rock formations all around the level. And if you step on those, they hurt you. And it's like, that's fine. But when you're fighting it, like, especially in the first part of the level, and you've never really played the game for that long, the last thing you need is to be backing up into rocks that damage your character that visually don't represent on screen until it's too late. So a lot of times a good tester is not just like, oh, I found a bug, but it's like, look, man, the team, you guys are way too close to this. You've been doing this for 3 years, every single day, weekends, nights, what have you. This is some stuff you probably didn't notice. And so I probably contributed more to that, but I don't remember some super bug that, we were up till 4 a.m. and on Dracula and we finally found it. I really was not that engaged in that part of the work because I was using it as a stepping stone. As mercenary as that sounds, that's the truth.
So before God of War, you made Twisted Metal for the PS1. What
Mhm.
was one big lesson you learned from that you then implemented in creating God of War?
Well, we did Twisted Metal 1 and 2 on the PS1. And then we did Twisted Metal Black on the PS2. And then I had a real big failure in between 2 and Black that never came out, which is where the most of the lessons come from that. Twisted 1 and 2 and Black were very big hits. But if I think of Twisted Metal, the biggest lesson, honestly, I mean, there's a lot of lessons, but one of them is do what you're good at. I mean, you don't have to. You can always try to get better. You should. But I directed these live action movies that your dad was an editor on, and they're horrible. They're just terrible. I'm not a good director. I'm not really a very good writer, even though that's what I thought I was going to go out to California and do. And that was a great eye-opening experience. I mean, they live on now on the internet, and people they're good in a stupid, cheesy, these are awful way, but they're not good stories, you know. So I learned that I wasn't that wasn't really my thing, and it could be, I guess, if I wanted to, but I didn't realize, you know, more often than not, the things that you want to be good at, you put the time into, and I clearly wasn't putting the time into getting good at that. In terms of game design, I think the biggest, I'll tell you what it was, if you look at the jump, and again, it's hard to tell now because it's so antiquated, but if you look at the jump between Twisted Metal 1 and Twisted Metal 2 is a much deeper game. There's a lot more stuff to do, and there's a lot more stuff to think about. And what Twisted Metal 1 taught me was most of the best gameplay happens in the person's head. So even if you're talking about a very action, you know, barely have time to think, like a competitive fighting game, whether it's MK11 or Smash Bro or whatever, or a first person shooter, a good game engages the brain. I don't mean that like you go off and think philosophical thoughts about things, but I mean that a good game will have you going, this, if I'm playing a fighting game, this enemy tends to like to attack low and he knows I'm going to block. How do I want to switch that up? If I'm playing a shooter, you know, this enemy that I'm fighting, if it's competitive and he's a real person, this enemy in Fortnite really likes to hide behind wood bridges that he builds or wood staircases that he builds. And I mean, again, it's hard in Fortnite because you don't know who you're going to be competing against at any one time. But even on the moment, you're like, how do I deal with a player who is engaging me that way? That's what makes a good game. And it took Twisted Metal, which thank God was a hit, just by absolute luck. I mean, I made stuff I thought was cool. The team made stuff we thought were cool, but we didn't know anything. And the second one was me going, oh, I get it. I need to build in depth to mechanics and level design and all these things that the player will think about. There's a great quote that has never been wrong. It is brilliant for game designers. A guy named Sid Meier, who's most famous for the Civilization games on PC, but he's been doing strategy games forever. His definition of a game is, or a good game is, a game is basically a series of interesting choices. And I think that's absolutely right. If your brain is constantly engaged going, what do I do next? And is trying to figure out what you do next, an interesting choice, you have a great game, whether it looks beautiful or it's a little indie game that is made by one dude in a bedroom.
Yeah. How did you first get the idea for God of War?
Well, I love Greek mythology. My first real exposure to it was Clash of the Titans back in 1981. And that movie came out the same summer as Raiders of the Lost Ark, two of my favorite movies of all time. And I love adventure games. When I was growing up, I loved adventure games. I love them to this day. Not like necessarily point and click adventure games, but more like going on a grand journey, whether it's Zelda or God of War or whatever. And I knew after Twisted Metal Black, I had kind of freedom at Sony to make whatever I wanted. And I'm like, okay, well, if I'm going to do what I want, and I'm going to do it exactly the way I want, with the team that I want, with the producer that I want, what have I always wanted to make? And I always at that point had wanted to make a game that really delivered on the promise that you saw on the back of the box of video game boxes. A lot of boxes would be like, go on this grand adventure with Banjo-Kazooie or whatever. But ultimately, you play Banjo-Kazooie, which is a great game on the N64, but most of what you're doing is collecting things and getting lost in the map. And it doesn't really feel like you're on this grand journey. It feels more like you're collecting music notes and stuff to put into a bag. And I was like, how can we make a game that feels like you really are on this great adventure? And then I was like, well, of course, let's do it with Greek mythology because, you know, Gladiator had come out. It was a big hit. I love violence in games. I love blood and gore and all that stuff. You know, a lot of people now, I'm 49 years old now, and I still love that stuff. And there's an age, and I don't know if you've aged out of it or you're not there yet, or you may never be there, but there's an age that most of my friends were when you're about 12 to 14. And you have this kind of great, to me, blend in your psyche of you're still enough of a little kid that you're totally into sci-fi, but you're also growing up into enough of an adult that you're interested in violence and adult themes and all that stuff. And there was a great magazine and a great movie at the time called Heavy Metal that really infused those things brilliantly. And that was sort of the impetus for God of War, which is if I'm going to make what I want to do an adventure that feels like a real adventure. I don't want a lot of padding in the gameplay. I don't want a lot of retreading over old ground. And I want to do it in a way that thematically speaks to that part of me that is still very much alive, which is, there's a part of my brain that's perpetually 13, 14, 15 years old and still adores that stuff. And that was sort of where it came from.
So obviously you had to do a lot of research into Greek mythology and all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
How much extensive research do you do, and like what did it look like? Was there a research team, or was it just
No.
a
I
few of
went
you
to
Googling stuff?
Japan. I got a book when I was growing up. It may have changed. I know Neil Gaiman just put out what is potentially the definitive look at Norse mythology. But when I was growing up, there was a woman named Edith Hamilton who really had kind of written the Bible, the Western Bible of sort of the Greek myths. She had kind of compiled, I mean, there's no right Greek myth. It's all fantasy anyway. But she had kind of said, these are sort of the main myths. These are sort of how they've been handed down over millennia at this point, and I'm going to put them in a book. And so I went to Japan for the first time, and I just remember I had her book, and I rode the bullet trains to the countryside, and I had a pen, and I just marked up that book like crazy. Every couple of pages, it was like, oh my God, that's a cool mechanic, or oh my God, that's a really cool monster, or whatever. And so I came back to LA, and I just kind of went through the notes, and I don't know if I put them on a spreadsheet or a Word document or what, and I just sort of started. God of War is interesting because you can see it on YouTube, the prototype level that we built, and it doesn't look Greek myth at all. It kind of does a little bit, but we were already in production before I knew what the story was, who the character was, what the plot was. All we knew was it's Greek mythology, it's going to be really violent and brutal, and it's going to be really slickly produced. Go. And then we were producing and writing, and I mean, everything. And it was really a fascinating process because so much about that game, everything from his chains to his white skin, um, all of that stuff, or a lot of that stuff, came out of production issues or problems. The reason he has those weapons is because we wanted a camera that was pulled back. And we looked at games like Devil May Cry and Eco, and there was one other one, and it was like, it's great because you can see the enemies and you can see the level when you're pulled back this far. But what's really hard is he's so tiny and you lose him and all the blood and lighting and all that. And we looked at a game called Shinobi, which is a ninja game on the PS2. And the character of the ninja has this big red flowing scarf. And so no matter how far they pulled the camera back, you could always tell where your character was because his scarf. And one of our designers on the team said, oh, we could do something like that, but let's do it like with chains or something. So his chain weapons absolutely came from just going, we don't know how to make the character stand out, right? Or the fact that, and I don't know how far you've played in the game, but his white skin plays a very big part. Not like his white, like Aryan racist skin. I don't mean that. I mean like he is covered in pure white, and red tattoos. That plays a very big part in the story. But the only reason that's in there is because Charlie Wynn, who was the art director and the character designer, who actually went on to design the first phase of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Guy's super talented. Designed Thor's costume for Chris Hemsworth and everything. But regardless, when he would draw, I don't know art, right? So I went over to his drawing board and I saw a character he was drawing, which was sort of inspired by conversations we'd had. And he was totally white. And I was like, oh my God, that's such a cool image. He goes, oh, I haven't colored it yet. I guess he would put like primer, like a base white layer first and then paint on top of it. And so I just happened to walk over at the right moment and see it when it wasn't finished. And I didn't know what he was doing. And that suddenly became a huge story point that when you get to it, and it's also a visual iconography that really defines that character. I think if that character had gone out without the white skin, he would not have been as, successful in terms of sort of, because he's he's arguably at this point Sony's most recognizable character. I mean, you could say Spider-Man, but Sony doesn't really own that in terms of video game properties. And I don't think it's the most successful game. I think that's Uncharted. But I think if you showed most people Kratos and you showed most people Nathan Drake, most people would say, oh, I know Kratos. Nathan Drake's kind of generic. But anyway, it doesn't matter. But the point is that the production of things leads to the story leads to production, technical limitations lead to design. I mean, the reason that we had harpy wings that are translucent and you can see the veins and stuff like that is because the lead programmer and I literally wanted to kill each other because I wanted to do translucency. And he was worried that would hit the frame rate. And he was obsessed with it being 60 frames a second. And I'm like, I don't care if it dips to 45 frames every now and then. I don't want the player to not be able to see anything. And so somebody came up and said, let's make the wings see-through and you guys both win. So it's just the fascinating part of working on a game is that, it's a long process and there's lots of talent and things just influence everything else. And by the end of it, what you end up with is like, holy cow, we would have never ended up here if we didn't do this together. So it's a really cool experience.
What did some of the earlier versions of the game look like story-wise?
It was so fluid, man. I mean, that there was never like, it wasn't like, Star Wars, where for a long time it was Luke Starkiller and he was this. It was always going to be some adventure story about this hero going after something. It was very much built on the bones of Raiders Lost Ark as a sort of as a plot device, right? Pandora's box is the Ark of the Covenant, basically, from Raiders. I mean, there were things, right? I mean, we for a while it was very much like the Mandalorian before the Mandalorian, because we were both inspired by, I forget what it was called, Japanese manga, Lone Wolf and Cub, which is about sort of a samurai with a baby. So we had Kratos, who wasn't called Kratos, he was called Dominus, with a little baby for a while. And then we changed it to a dog. And then, I mean, there was, stuff like that. But when we found an idea we liked, that locked into place. And then everything around it that was still fluid adjusted to support what we had locked in. So once I was like, oh, he's got these blades of chaos, that's done because the character looks great on screen. Now, how do we write around that? What are those? And at first he was going to be based on Diana, I think her name was, which is Perseus's mom, who was put into a box at sea by a king of some city because she had an affair with Zeus and thrown into the ocean. So Kratos originally was going to be a guy who had been captured and chained up and put in a box and thrown in the ocean. And the box crashed on the shores of Athens. And he came out and the chains were still on him. It just changes as development progresses. So it was never like, oh, it was always going to be about X. And then 8 months in, something happened and suddenly it was different. It was never like that. It was just every day it was fluid. And when things locked into place, we wrote and designed around what was locked into place.
Hey, sorry to pop in here, but I need to tell you about today's sponsor. Today's episode is sponsored by Hoffman's Wood Stuff. They make custom furniture, household items, and gifts out of sustainably sourced woods. You can find them on Instagram at Hoffman's Wood Stuffs. And by mentioning the podcast in your order, you will receive 20% off your total order. It's one wild idea that at one point was going to be implemented in the game, but just never ended up getting added.
You can go on YouTube and look up either on my channel or just look up God of War demo or behind the scenes or prototype. In that, we had a level in God of War which was totally done, which was Kratos riding this elevator up these cliffs, this kind of ancient rickety elevator. And there was a sandstorm chasing him. And, we could never figure out in the time we had how to do the sandstorm. So everything else was done, but we had to cut that. We had a giant Titan chasing Kratos across the desert at the end. We did prototype that, but we had to cut that. We had the Icarus wings in God of War 1 that was like an old arcade game where you were able to fly all over this section of the map from over the shoulder. But again, we ran out of time. So there's always stuff you have to cut constantly, continuously. The interesting thing about it, and again, this is maybe interesting to me, and maybe your dad, not to you, but when I was at USC with your father, Jeffrey Katzenberg, I don't know if you know who that is, but he's a big famous executive and he kind of ran Disney. Then he ran DreamWorks Animation. Then he just did Quibi, which tanked, but whatever. But it was interesting because he was the executive that came to Disney and said, all their animated movies forever had almost been made like I'm describing God of War was made. They weren't making it up as they went along. They had an outline, but it wasn't like there was a real screenplay. And he came into Disney Animation and said, "This is ridiculous. Why don't you guys have a screenplay?" And they're like, "We've never done it that way. We storyboard it and then we change things and that changes this." And he's the guy that was there that kicked off, The Little Mermaid and Aladdin and Beauty and the Beast. And there was like two or three more that really reinvigorated animation back in the 90s, I think it was. And the point is that I look at video games right now very much like that, where I don't know if we're there yet, but it sure would be nice to start a game with a roadmap that is going to change, because games are about iteration and finding the fun. And you can't find that on paper, but it would be nice if more games could start with a better building plan. But I don't know if that's ever going to happen because the nature of the iteration of video games, but we'll see.
So the different mini games inside of the battles, like when you would
Yep.
rotate the joystick or stuff like that, makes the player feel more involved in the battle. What were some difficulties with like training the player to use it and implementing it into the game?
The difficulty was figuring out how to do it. I knew I wanted you as a player to feel, at the time, I mean, now we're talking about what, a 15-year-old game, but at the time, we were like, we want this player, when you play the game, to feel brutal. We want you to feel powerful. We want you to feel like this character. And we knew that we didn't want to do it in cutscenes for the most part. We knew that we didn't want to do it where we took control from the player. But it's also really hard to build in 50 unique animations and train the player. Here's how you rip off a head versus here's how you stab a minotaur in the mouth. So all of these things had to be very context sensitive. And at first we were doing it almost literal. So you would get on top of the Cyclops and it was like a rodeo thing where you would have to balance on top of the Cyclops in order to stab him and kill him. And then finally we were like, the animation looks so good when it's canned that's where a lot of those mini games came from, which was sort of quick time events before they were popular. And I think it's good they're not as popular as they used to be. But there was a stretch there after God of War, after Resident Evil 4, where there was a great like 5, 6, 7 years where everyone was using them. And then I think the popularity, rightly so, is kind of abated. But it was really just a way to give the player a sense of, you're really doing these cool moves. That was sort of what we were trying to do.
So video games are generally made on fast schedules, even though they might take a couple years to make. It's still a lot of work crammed into a couple years. How did you manage your time as a game designer between managing productions and the storytelling and all that stuff?
Well, okay, so I mean, video games, especially the God of War, took 3 years. Most AAA games these days take 3 years to 4 years to 5 years. These are not short things anymore. They take as long as an animated movie. They cost more than an animated movie now. The Last of Us Part 2, I think the budget was $220 million, right? I mean, it's insane. So, and the teams, rightly so, have gotten bigger with more specialized people. Our team was about 40 people in God of War. But what I'll tell you, as for how I managed it, I'm not joking. I've been diagnosed. I have a blazing case of attention deficit disorder. I am all over the place. I do take meds for it, but I have always done well in video games when I have had strong producers with me. So we had a very interesting structure at Santa Monica. At the time was very rare, but now I think it's begun to permeate more, which is I was totally creatively in charge of everything. And my producer, Shannon, she was totally in charge of the production. So a lot of studios for a while, it was like the producer was at the top of the pyramid, but that didn't really work well because depending on the value, a good producer has nothing to do usually with being a good creative. They're good at management and scheduling and figuring out how to get the programmer to not kill the artist. And it's a very great necessary skill. And once we did that, because the game before that was a failure, I was trying to direct and produce and it never got shipped because I couldn't manage the conflict in my head between, yeah, I need to produce this on time, but I never want to say no to myself because I'm so brilliant. And so when we had that, Shannon had a couple of producers. There was a designer producer, there was an art producer. And so we just worked out a flow that was like, okay, we've got to get story worked on this week. everybody keep stuff off Jaffe's plate, and he's just focused on story. And next week it's got to be combat. And on Tuesday, though, he's got to do press. I was very well managed and scheduled. Not everyone needs that, but I absolutely did. So that's kind of how, it was still a nightmare. That's why I don't do big games anymore, or games right now at all, because it was constant work. It wasn't fun. It was fun to have the result. It was fun to have the ideas. It was fun to see people enjoy the games. But the moment to moment, I did not really enjoy very much. It was not a great fit for me. So a lot of people adore it, but I didn't love the moment to moment of it at all. So it was hard.
What point during the process do story elements need to be finished? Coding, art, how do they all compare to when different stuff is finished? It needs to be.
It's absolutely all different. Everything has dependencies. More often than not, the code will, so you'll get to a place called alpha, which you probably know what that is, but if you don't, or if your listeners don't, that's where it's almost like I'm terrible at analogies on the fly, but that's like you're making a stew and all the ingredients have been put into the pot. So you've got everything you need to make the game, and it's starting to cook, but you still have to get to beta. And beta is that alpha beta process is where you're doing a lot of play testing and you're adjusting and taking some stuff out, blah, blah, blah. So a lot of it is, you're heading to alpha, which is where you want to shut the gates and say nothing new comes in. So that would drive a lot of it. But I am a very, demanding guy, and I didn't care about alpha. So I was like, I still want more things. And I got my way more often than not. And it caused great turmoil on the team because the coders were like, we're locked. We got the game working. Let's just polish it. Jaffe wants to add another boss. Like, yep. And it was a horrible fighting environment. But that said, though, we ended up making a game that did well and started a franchise. Sometimes or oftentimes creative conflict amongst passionate people who all want the best for the title, that's actually of great value. I think our society has kind of painted it, or any kind of conflict, in a way that's negative, and you want to avoid conflict. And certainly you don't want to be mean to people, and you don't want to hurt each other, but you don't want to be making these games or stories or movies or books or anything that requires willing something into existence, which is incredibly difficult. You don't want to be doing that with teammates who just don't care. The fact that I had a lead programmer that I didn't literally, but I wanted to kill, and he wanted to kill me, was great for God of War, because it created a need to put two people who really wanted to win badly on a path to success, as long as that energy could be harnessed, which is why you need a great producer.
Obviously, as you said, there were many different fights. What are some fights you got in with the studio or other people on the team about stuff that you had to fight really hard for to get into the game, and some stuff that got
I
cut
never
that you were fighting for?
Well, the stuff I got cut, you can compete with the programmer, you can compete with marketing, you can't compete with time. Ultimately, we had extended the game as far as we could. We probably had 3 extensions. And ultimately, Sony's like, look, we've spent a lot of money on this game. It has to come out in March. I know you would love to tweak it till the cows come home, but we got to put it out there. I'm like, all right. So that line wasn't movable. I had won as much of that fight as I was going to win. So the things that got cut were more, nothing I can do about it. There's no time. I can't compete with that. I can't argue against time. I can, probably wouldn't win. I'd try it though. But that said though, the only real argument, I didn't lose arguments for the most part because I had final creative authority, which is not to say I did whatever I wanted. Part of that creative authority is knowing who to listen to and going, okay, I've heard 10 ideas. Yours is way better than mine. Let's go with yours. But the only time I ever was told no on God of War about something creative, and this was, so Shannon and I were equal on the hierarchy, and we had a guy who ran the studio. He was the studio head. And he wasn't involved in making the game, writing the game. He just wanted the best for the studio. The agreement was when Shannon and I couldn't agree, we would go to him and he would make the decision. And there was only one time we couldn't agree. And it was, I really wanted to do like game creators commentary. So for every level, there would be a separate audio track where me and the team would kind of like on a DVD or Blu-ray back in the day, we would talk about, oh, this is the Hydra level. And this is why Ken Feldman, the art director, did this. And this is why Charlie did that, and we did that, and that took a huge amount of space on the disc. and we would have been able to fit it all, but we would have had to have gotten rid of the credits in the game. And we would have had the credits in the manual, of course. But the head of the studio, Shannon, was like, no, we can't do that to the team. And I'm like, who cares? It's in the manual. They're like, well, they want to show their parents. I'm like, their parents aren't going to play to the end of God of War. Show them the damn manual. But anyway, though, so that decision we couldn't agree on. That went to Alan Becker, who ran the studio at the time. And he was like, yeah, let's put the credits in. So that was the only time I ever lost a creative battle. I'm sure the coders lied to me at times to win and like, oh, we can't do that technically. Okay. I mean, I can't really argue with that either, but
So what was the biggest challenge that you had throughout all of production? Something that you just kept tweaking basically until launch, until you had it just right?
everything. And I don't mean that like to not give you a fun answer, but we play tested this game constantly. So we would bring in people, all walks of life, gamers, non-gamers, different ages. And we had a testing room where we could sit downstairs and we had monitors and they were upstairs and we saw what they were playing and we saw their faces. And then after the words, they would fill out like 5, 6, 7 page responses. What did they like? What didn't they like? Would they buy it? Would they not? Blah, blah, blah. We would videotape those and I would take these tapes that were 5, 6 hours home per person. And I would spend my weekends with notepads just going through every single, I mean, I was obsessed. I wanted this game to work so badly. And I would go through every tape and go, people are getting stuck there. People are confused about this there. People are taking too long in general, on average, to win this battle here. And so it wasn't so much one thing. It was tons and tons and tons of notes that every 2-3 weeks after a play test, we would have to be like, okay, we've got 80 new notes that are important. Let's prioritize them and let's shift what we're doing in production. So a lot of those things I was telling you that got cut, those things got cut because they're like, okay, Jaffe, you can have, I heard it described as the popsicle stick method. They do this at Pixar, where the producer goes to the director and says, look, you can do what you want, but here are your popsicle sticks. And the popsicle sticks represent time. So you can't get any more popsicle sticks. So it's like, where do you want to spin those popsicle sticks? So I would come in and I was watching videotapes all weekend where people could not get past Athens, the level Athens, or they could, but it was kind of like, I don't know, it took too long. They didn't rate it well. So they're like, okay, these 80 notes you just gave us, we can totally do those. But if we do those, you got to lose the sandstorm. And I'm like, oh man, okay, I'll lose the sandstorm, right? I'm playing a game right now. I think I mentioned it, Blue Fire, made by a brand new team, small team. And it is amazing the value of playtest because I played this on stream last night. It controls beautifully. The fighting system is great. There's literally a part where I stopped playing the game. I'm streaming this out, ultimately after video on demand and stuff. There's like 3,000 people that will ultimately watch this video, give or take the success of the game, how popular it is, right? And I literally publicly am like, okay, I played it for an hour and a half. I have to stop playing this. I don't know what to do. I don't know where to go next. And it was literally as simple as there was a lever up on the wall. And before that, there was a little how to play tutorial card that popped up. And it was telling you how to lock on to things in the game, but it was showing you barrels, and barrels were all around you. And the lever blended into the architecture of the world. So it didn't look like an interactive object. So I spent 20 minutes destroying barrels and no one in the stream was like, oh, you need to do that. No one knew what to do. So we stopped. Well, ultimately the lever that blended into the level visually was exactly all I needed to do was lock onto the lever, let go of the stick. My character flies into the lever, flips the lever, the gate opens, we're moving on. Well, that's something that if you play test your game and you care about that, you would be like, oh my God, that's such an easy fix. That literally would take an artist 10 minutes to go in and fix that. And suddenly somebody who's streaming their game or bought their game and refunding it because this was only the first hour, get your money back on Steam or Xbox if it's under 2 hours, suddenly they're continuing to play. So that play test, man, I mean, that is crucial. It is absurd. People don't obsess over it more.
I have two similar questions here. One,
Yep.
what was the toughest story problem that you creatively had? And two, what was the toughest technical game design problem you had? And how did you solve them?
The story problem on God of War specifically I mean, again, the story was so organic in a while, man. What did we struggle? And we struggled with all of it. I mean, I don't remember struggling in terms of like a big story problem. I probably, if anything, it was having to adjust and rewrite the story constantly as production came and went, as we lost a boss, for example, or as we couldn't have a third act level and we had to figure out how to bring Kratos back to Athens, not because of story, but because of we didn't have the money and the time to do the big ship battle where he was going to go from Pandora's temple back to Athens after the desert had flooded or whatever. So a lot of the challenge in story was just you are writing, it's a cliche, but it's true. It's like you're building an airplane while it's on the runway and taking off, and you're also building it while it's flying. So by the time the airplane lands, you're just done building it. And thank God you've built the wheels so it can land at the right moment, because you didn't have them when you were 30,000 feet above the air or above the ground. So that's probably the challenge, is writing on the fly. Technically, it was just frame rate, because I wanted a lot of stuff in there. And I know the combat feels better when we're locked at 60, and we were for the most part. And it was probably frame rate, just struggling with that.
Looking back years later, what is something you wish you would have done differently while creating God of War?
Honestly, there's a part at the end of the game where Kratos is in hell or Hades or whatever. And there is it's a very specific thing, but it's the thing that everybody cites as the most frustrating part of the game. And as a gamer, I hate stuff like this. And lo and behold, sure enough, it's the one part of the game we did not play test, because it's at the end of the game. And we figured, you know what, we got this. We're busy. We're trying to wrap this up. We've done hundreds of play tests at this point, or hundreds of people at this point. I know what I need to do. Well, I didn't. And so there's this spinning column that Kratos climbs up, and there are these spike blades on the edge of the column. And he's got to kind of time when he goes up and down and around so he doesn't hit the blades, because they'll hurt him and they'll knock him off back to the bottom. And the programmer came over when he saw me and the level designer building this, and he says, our collision doesn't do that very well. And the designer and I were like, we'll figure it out. Stupid. So we did it, and it's horrible. And it is absolutely, thank God it's so deep into the game that if you're there, you care about the game enough, most people get past it. But I would say that's probably, people have talked about, hey, are they going to do a God of War 1 remaster or remake, kind of like what Bluepoint just did with Demon Souls? I don't know. That hasn't been announced. But if they do, out of everything that gets touched, I want that fixed for sure. But that would probably be the biggest regret I have over it.
Mm-hmm. So, what was the biggest lesson you learned from making God of War?
It took a long time to learn it. I mean, I'm still learning it, but probably that I don't really like the job as much as I should to do a job that hard. Honestly, that's just the truth. It is so surrounded by fun, right? That what you make is fun, and having the ideas are fun, and seeing those ideas executed and making people happy is fun, and making the money is fun, and being, part of culture. I've had people come up to me because of Twisted Metal and God of War more and more and more. And I don't say this like I don't walk around thinking I'm a big deal. I don't think I'm a big deal, but they'll say to me, it's like, Jaffe, you were really, your stuff that you and the team built was a really big part of my childhood, right? Well, I don't think about that, but when I hear that, I'm like, oh, that's kind of fun. That's nice. It's so easy when you're surrounded by the trappings of that to think you're having fun. But ultimately, when I really got quiet with myself and I was like, I just don't like the moment to moment work of doing this. It's not fun to me. That's taken a long time, because when you get all those accolades and the money and the power and all that stuff that comes with it, why would you want to walk away from that? That's everything. It's like, this is what you're supposed to want. So, I mean, that's a very esoteric lesson to learn. I'm sure you were looking for something like, oh, well, never use Unity if you're trying to get 60 frames, but frankly, that's the most important lesson I learned.
What's next for you? What are you currently working on?
So I had a company called Bartlett Jones Supernatural Detective Agency a couple years back. We shut that down. The game we put out didn't do so well. And I was like, okay, I don't know what I want to do next. And at first I was like, yeah, let me go build another company, make another game. I started making videos. I started doing a stream about the game industry and about video game design and just stupid stuff too. I mean, just dumb crap, and I have had so much fun. And maybe that's another reason that I've learned this lesson now, because I finally started doing something that I adore. I'm not big at it. I'm not great at it yet. I'm certainly not successful at it compared to what you need to do to make a living at it, but it's a joy to me. And so I'm doing my stream, I'm doing my videos, and I'm trying to build it into a business. We'll see what happens, but that's really where my head's at. A lot of people ask me, when are you going to make another game? I don't have any thoughts about making another game right now. It's not on my radar. I'm not saying I won't. Like, I was playing this Blue Fire, and part of me is like, oh, let me go to these guys and say, let me just be a consultant for you guys for a month. And let me just give you guys notes. I could make this so much better. I would be interested in something like that. But the idea of like building a team and fighting with the team and struggling with the arts, no, I'm done. I'm done. Plus, the industry's changed, man.
Thank you so much for your time
Miles,
today.
you are welcome, pal. You got it, buddy.
And that's how the interview went down. As I said before, if you mention this podcast in your next order from Hoffman's Wood Stuff, you will receive 20% off your total order. You can follow Game Design Hour on Instagram at Game Design Hour. If you enjoyed this episode, please hit subscribe or follow. It's different on every platform so that you don't miss the next episode, which is an interview with Sean Patton, a designer on the VR game I Expect You to Die. I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and I'll see you next time on Game Design Hour.